Welcome back to Truths of a Madman. Today, I want to talk about something huge, something that history is already writing about, but a lot of people still aren't seeing clearly. The U.S. military operation in Venezuela, the capture of President Nicolás Maduro, isn't just a headline or a war story. It's a massive historical moment that tells us something very real about the nature of world power, capitalism, and how the United States interacts with the rest of the world. Some people are calling it self-defense or a mission against drug trafficking. Some are cheering it as a victory for so-called freedom and democracy. But if we use dialectical materialism to really look at what's going on, meaning we analyze actual material conditions, power, class interests, and contradictions in history, then a much clearer picture starts to form. This isn't an isolated event. This is centuries of policy, from the Monroe Doctrine to modern imperial strategy, showing up again in the 21st century. Let's get into it. To understand what's happening today, we have to go back, all the way back to the early 19th century. In 1823, President James Monroe announced what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, a foreign policy idea that basically said European powers aren't allowed to interfere in the Americas. This sounds almost harmless at first, but the deeper material reality was that this doctrine laid the foundation for the US to act like policemen of our hemisphere. Over time, that idea slowly changed from keep Europe out to the US gets to shape what happens here. Later, in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt added what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary, basically saying the US could intervene militarily anywhere in Latin America to stabilize it. That doctrine, which once justified interventions in places like Panama and Nicaragua, has evolved for 200 years into something some are now calling Trump's Donroe Doctrine, a modern version aimed at its asserting U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. When you look at it that way, the capture of Maduro isn't random. It's consistent with the long pattern of U.S. intervention and imperial assertiveness, using military force, economic pressure, and political influence to shape the governments of nearby countries. So, why Venezuela? No secret, Venezuela sits on some of the largest oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia. That oil is not just valuable, it's strategic. And for decades, U.S. policy towards Venezuela was shaped by that fact. In recent decades, the U.S. called Maduro's government illegitimate, imposed strict economic sanctions, and designated state-linked groups as narco-terrorists. But the story gets deeper. When the U.S. recently orchestrated military action, including strikes and the capture of Maduro, it wasn't about pressing drug charges. U.S. officials talked about rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure and safeguarding it from major American oil corporations. That's not accidental. Material interest, the driving force in capitalism's global relations. From a dialectical viewpoint, capital seeks new sources of profit and security, and states act to protect those interests. This isn't about democracy, it's about strategic control over energy and markets, a younger form of the same impulses that drove colonial powers centuries ago. And then there's China, a major partner with Venezuela long before this happened. China buys lots of Venezuelan oil and they've invested heavily there over the years. Now, after the US invasion, this could push countries in Latin America to rethink their alliances responding to US pressure. The US narrative now, talking about protecting, quote, Western Hemisphere's interests, sounds like a new Cold War. But here's the key detail. China's not trying to conquer the US or dominate militarily. China is focused on economic partnerships and development, not global domination. So what's really happening? Not a new Cold War, but a competition between capitalist powers, each trying to lock on in influences, markets, and political alignments so that their ruling classes get stronger and more profitable. That's imperialism in the 21st century. Not old-fashioned land grabbing, but control through economics, access to resources, and political leverage. Now, let's connect this to something deeper. What capitalism does internally. When capitalism concentrates wealth in the hands of a small elite, what Marxists call the ruling class or bourgeoisie, it naturally produces contradictions. Huge inequality at home often pushes states to find new markets and new profits abroad. The cycle of expansion. Imperialism isn't a bug, it's a feature of capitalism's drive to grow. That's why powerful states intervene abroad, create puppet governments, or protect resource access. Because the ruling class profit motives are baked into the system. And when you combine that with rising nationalism and militarism, whether in the US or elsewhere, you get aggressive foreign policy moves that look more like protections for capital than protections for human rights. So what does all this mean? It means the US invasion and capture of Nicolás Maduro is not just a one-off event. The continuation of historical patterns rooted in imperialism, the pursuit of resources, geopolitical competition, and the priorities of the ruling class. It's also a reminder that if we don't look at history and material conditions honestly, we can be easily misled by politicians' explanations. Words like freedom, security, and democracy get thrown around, but the actions favor power and profit over people's well-being. I'm not here to sell you a simple villain or tell you every detail is black and white. Reality is messy. But from a dialectical materialist perspective, what we can see is that there is a consistent logic, not of human liberation, but of empire and capital maximizing influence and control. Understanding that helps us see past the rhetoric and ask the real question. Who benefits from this? Who pays the price? And how do ordinary people, the working class, gain power in a world shaped by rules they didn't write? If we keep asking those questions, maybe we can find a different way forward. One built not on interests of the few, but on the needs of the many. Thanks for watching. And remember, the only thing we have to lose is our chains. Workers of the world unite.